The tanks of the battalion, despite often being immobilized by a lack of fuel, fought quite ferociously. And a fair few did claim the destruction of several German vehicles, as well as resisting a large number of hits. A B1 Bis allegedly claimed to have knocked out 3 enemy vehicles with the 47mm and 4 with the 75mm before being put out of operation. Another B1 Bis claimed to have 3 tank kills while being hailed with bullets itself, including the 75mm high explosive shell to the turret. On the 15th, it found itself with no support whatsoever from either infantry, artillery or aviation, while opposing German tanks which were supported by all 3. German vehicles also vastly outnumbered the French. In one instance, a B1 Bis reported to being engaged by about 15 Panzer III and Panzer IVs. Luckily, the crew escaped miraculously despite the broken radiator thanks to a slope which allowed the vehicle to escape for a moment, long enough for the crew to be rescued by another B1 Bis. By the point, the 28th Battalion retreated on the evening of the 15th and only 7 of its B1 Bis were still in hands. The 37th did not fare any better. It was also engaged from 8:30 am. The battalion was also able to push back the German advance with losses in the morning, but was forced to retreat in the afternoon. A move in which the 3 companies found themselves completely isolated, which turned out to be disastrous. Under the orders of General Bernaud, the 2nd Company tried to launch a counterattack towards the south, fearing encirclement. The company faced off against Panzer Regiment 31 and the 5th Panzer Division, supported by anti-tank guns. The following fight resulted in all of the company's surviving tanks being lost and a large number of personnel, including once again the company's leader, Captain Le Haut. Only the 1st Company was able to retreat properly with 7 tanks. In a single day, the 37th Battalion had lost 23 B1 Bis tanks. The remaining elements of the division were engaged in a separate defense of the town of Beaumont on the following day. Both the battalions remaining were basically annihilated in the defense of the town. A few elements continued to fight a fighting retreat on the 17th, but by that point the 1st basically ceased to exist as an operational unit. They tried to reform the 1st, but this was a desperate attempt to stop the German advance, which never came to full strength. The 2nd. The 2nd was led by Brigadier General Albert Bruch. I'm sorry if I mispronounce any of these names, just my apologies in advance. They were fully outfitted by the beginning of hostilities in May 1940. The division was being kept in reserve at the orders of the French Northeastern Headquarters. After the beginning of operations on the 10th of May, the division was quickly put into high alert and was ordered to move north towards Belgium to provide assistance to troops located in the area. The division's movement north would prove to be fatal though. In order to move north, the tracked and wheeled elements of the divisions were separated, which included pretty much all of the reconnaissance and logistical means of the division would move by road, while the tracked vehicles would move by rail. The German breakthrough at Sedan on the 13th pushed new orders for the division to reform around the forest of Signy for the 14th and onward, but this would prove to be not successful. Various elements of the 2nd would be unloaded at a variety of railway stations to be put at disposition of the various infantry commanders in order to attempt to stop the German breakthrough and the crossing of the Meuse. The 8th BCC elements were first engaged on the 15th of May. The battalion's 3 companies were all unloaded at different stages, which highly complicated the coordination of the unit. The companies all operated in several small towns on the Oise River in order to defend the bridges on the river and prevent the German crossing. The 1st and 3rd companies were further fragmented, with several tanks being sent on individual missions to defend locations separate from the main force of the company. This isolation led to very high losses for the battalion. In the period from the 15th to the 18th of May, all tanks of the 1st Company which were sent on individual missions were lost, along with large parts of the 2nd and 3rd Battalion as well. As for the 15th BCC, it did not fare any better. The 1st and 2nd Companies of the battalion were able to operate fairly closely with each other, while the 3rd was almost entirely separated. On the first day of enemy contact, the 16th of May, the first 2 companies would lose 6 tanks and considerably slowed down by their poor logistical facilities. The other 2 companies ended up divided into 3 elements, which operated in various parts of other units, ending with most tanks being lost. The 3rd Company was first engaged a bit later than other units, appearing to meet the German troops for the first time on the 17th of May. 2 of its tanks were engaged in an operation to clean up the village of Lanrecies on the 17th. These vehicles ended up encountering in the village a large park of German wheeled vehicles. This led to the 2 French tanks destroying the park's vehicles, of which the numbers vary greatly among the sources. Some estimate several dozens, others say hundreds. The third was created in 1940 but wasn't fully equipped by the start of the war. However, it seems like the B1 complement was complete. Just like the others, the situation on the front led that the third dislocated in small groups of tanks tasked to defending individual locations as early as the 14th of May. The division's two B1 Bis battalions, the 41st and the 49th BCC, were engaged in one of the most famous tank battles of the Battle of France. This was of course the Battle of Stonne, where the French and German troops harshly contested the town of Stonne with one another, which eventually was won by the Germans. The most intense phase of this battle was from the 15th to the 17th, where control of this town would switch up to 17 times. It is during the Battle of Stonne where one of the most well-known feats of the B1 Bis happened. On the 16th of May, one B1 Bis entered the main street of the village, only to find itself facing a column of 13 tanks. This was seemingly all made up of Panzer IVs and Panzer IIIs at very close range. Using its dual weapons, the French tank targeted the front vehicle with the 47mm and the rear vehicle with the 75mm, rendering maneuvers very complicated for the German vehicles. The tank then progressed along the column and it knocked out all of the German tanks within a few minutes. The frontal arm of the B1 Bis proved to be invulnerable against the German 75mm and the 37mm shells. Following this action, the B1 Bis left the town, knocking out two German anti-tank guns on the way. 140 non-penetrating impacts were found on the tank after this action, underlining the very good armor protection for the B1 Bis at the time. This battle would later be called the Verdun of 1940. The third also saw some subsequent losses in the retreat, which saw many of these vehicles break down, which would lead to them being abandoned. The fourth was only in the process of being formed when the Battle of France started. This formation was led by Charles de Gaulle. The first battle of the fourth was the Battle of Montcornet on the 17th of May, in which the division attacked a locality that had been seized by the Germans near the Eisenach River. Montcornet was another significant location for the logistics of the German tank division moving further west, and attacking the town was an attempt to prevent the continuation of the German push to the sea, though the French forces managed to push quite considerably at Montcornet. Even though the French forces managed to push quite considerably at Montcornet, they faced some considerable resistance in the form of a large number of anti-tank positions the Germans had set up. In the morning and early afternoon, most of the action was performed by the division's R-35s and D-2s, with the B1 Bis being unable to engage into deep action due to problems finding enough fuel. In the late afternoon and early evening, the tanks were engaged. Two B1 Bis were knocked out by a 88mm Flak 36 anti-aircraft gun, and they lost another two due to Stuka dive bombers. Even though the French lost more materials, they did win in casualties. 29 French casualties compared to the 100 German casualties. Despite the 4th DCR being better organized and cohesive than other divisions, it lacked aerial and infantry support, which made its vehicles very vulnerable to well-prepared anti-tank defenses. Though the division fought in a number of skirmishes around Eisenach the following days, the next major battle of the 4th would be around Abbeville. The division was engaged from the 28th to the 31st of May following a British assault on the previous day. The objective was to manage to link up with a large number of units stuck in the Dunkirk pocket and at least create a safe evacuation route for them. The B1 Bis's assault focused on the first village of Huppy on the 28th of May. The attack, starting in the late afternoon, saw the 47th BCC tank face off against the well-prepared German anti-tank positions. 4 tanks were immobilized, but the French troops managed to seize Huppy, but extending forward, the 47th encountered 2 well-placed German 88mm guns. The offense continued on the 29th, on the high place of Montcalbert, where 2 88mm were located. After a 2-hour-long exchange of fire in the morning, both guns were knocked out. The B1 Bis continued moving, but were not giving any form of infantry support, and their poor quality of radios hindered their coordination. 2 new German 88mm guns were once again able to stop the French advance. Around noon, several hundred German infantrymen charged the heavy tanks to no avail, as the charge ended in a bloodbath. In the afternoon, the French tanks attacked again with 9 B1 Bis tanks, with 5 ending up being knocked out by the 88mm gun. The final B1 Bis offensive was performed in the afternoon of the 30th, which made their attack very poorly coordinated. At the end of the day, only 4 of the 9 attacking tanks survived. Anyway, my opinion, it was a very decent tank, just not what France needed at the time. One of the massive drawbacks of this tank, which repeatedly came forward, was the issue of supplying the B1 Bis with enough fuel. In other words, your tank is basically useless when you cannot drive it. It had great armor, being invulnerable to the majority of German tanks at the time, but it was not totally invulnerable. It did have a good armament for 1940 standards though, however the commander of the B1 Bis was just simply overworked. During service they also had a massive disadvantage in general that they didn't have infantry support nor air support. So honestly I'm very curious to see how these tanks would have performed in the field if it was more equal. This will sound harsh, but I think the biggest issue altogether was that the French generals and commanders were incompetent compared to their German counterparts. Do you think the French could have held back the Germans if the leaders were more competent? Head on over to my community page and vote on this poll. Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, this was the video. Thank you very much for watching and I will see you guys in the next video.